before I migrate on to celebrating about other topics and subjects, I better get this particular topic out. So this is, I mean, I touched on this, I think maybe a little bit in the sort of in the stupidity thing, but this came up for me quite recently when I was sort of talking on a live stream with Good Mother and Iron Sun, especially about uh, the nature of uh, the kind of the identity politics temperament, and especially the things that Iron Sun was saying was reminding me of the things that I had had commented sort of psychologically a long time ago. So I just thought it would be good for me to brush up on summarizing the fundamental intellectual dishonesty and defect. Obviously, talking about narcissism and things like that are ways of describing them, but it's often, I think, quite good to get into the nitty gritty, into the detail of what makes the world view so fundamentally pernicious and sort of virulent. Uh, you know, and also dangerous. That's kind of within the ambit of its perniciousness. So yeah, and I'm going to talk about the ideological implications and how it functions within the realm of ideas, but also slightly within the realm of psychology. But I'm going to mainly focus on the realm of ideas. Um, and I probably will give a parallel to how it's like borderline personality disorder. I do think that it gives a very good template or model for borderline personality disorder. I do really think that it's not even narcissism primarily. It like its adherents are narcissistic, but the actual as it works as a collective ideology, as a hive mentality, as a structure of how it operates, it really does function as a single borderline personality disordered sort of hive mind. Uh, Obviously, that's a complicated metaphor because um, well, the identity entity itself, the identitarian um, containers of humanity in some sense, which are kind of ideological categories, those would be like the actual borderline entities, which is itself an abstraction, and then the adherents to that, they get sort of inducted and conscripted into serving that structure, that ideological category. They are, I mean, famously, uh, the flying monkeys is what is often described because of oh my word, the Wizard of Oz, the Wicked Witch. Uh, is assisted by her helpers, the flying monkeys, and so the uh, the handmaidens, the allies, and people that get inducted into the structure of the reality that is entrenched around sort of the borderline linchpin that stabilizes the ideological reality that is sort of transmitted from their perspective through, in some sense, through their valence, through their framing of it, through their relativism. So, in some sense, um, you know, uh, the relativism of the identity category is a very necessary component of the worldview. Without that relativism, it can't get away with its fundamental uh, equivocations and false equivalencies. But I need to go into that in some detail. So the thing that makes the ideology so capable of doubling down constantly and always sort of being able to reframe and decontextualize and recontextualize and psychologically penetrate and cherry pick, use reality filters to always sort of find the right way to vindicate itself as holding, sort of the sanctimonious, morally righteous higher ground, and moral authority, is because it actually has two parallel sets of false equivocations that it can rely on, and they work in parallel, and therefore there's a kind of infinite internal circular reasoning that they can muster between these two parallel sources of equivocation. The one is semantic. So essentially, they're making a kind of an assumed knowledge claim about what words actually mean. So it's one way of basically being able to gainsay reality, is that no, this is what the word actually means. So when you use the word outside of that sense, you're talking nonsense. So you can just dismiss anything else as just being noise. So essentially, they can just ignore and not have to negotiate, and because essentially they've got their own unilateral lexicon, which makes them not have to be responsive to any kind of actual counter reasoning against their position. So the semantic assumption, or the semantic definitional, sort of claim that they have, which is a weird kind of epistemological status that they award to themselves, and in some sense they do that sort of for basic nihilistic reasons as well, is that because they believe that it's all arbitrary anyway, that any kind of epistemology that can be woven is fundamentally ad hoc and arbitrary. Therefore, the only way to sort of bootstrap any kind of perspective is to huddle to some group, is to say that no, it's a shared lived experience. Therefore, that's what gives it its merit, is that it's sort of the number of conscripts that are in its rank, the how large a legion it speaks for. So it has this kind of blatant utilitarian sort of mass of quantitative virtue is so. And because, let's say, their matrix of identity can essentially encapsulate everyone, then they don't have to contest with anybody else's ideas, because those are just the ideas of an individual or something like that. Whereas all breakdowns of category and group are all-encompassing and permeate through everything. So essentially, because they've got that little semantic mechanism behind because they've got that philosophical mechanism behind their semantic matrix has a kind of totalizing claim over epistemology. And that's just a kind of blanket gainsaying or assumption. So they've got words that actually mean things. Everybody else has got words that mean nothing, essentially. That's what the semantic assumption is. So that's a get out of jail free card, as you will. That's very easy to pull that so they can just selectively ignore what somebody else says, because they don't have to think about it, because it's coming from a use of semantics which they essentially are given overt, absolute, immediate permission to disregard and to deflect, essentially. Okay, so that is almost dangerous in itself, and sort of deeply entrenched in a weird kind of demagogic nihilism of, just sort of pure numbers or something like that. And sort of hypothetically, they represent all the numbers. Uh, um, anyway, so and it's interesting because, by the way, when you're arguing philosophy or any kind of issue with someone who is lobbying volleys of criticisms that come from hard skeptical obstacles to your position, it's in that nature that people are pulling out these semantic legs from under your own. I don't have to think about what you say, because I can just imagine that each of those words don't mean what you think it means what I think it means. So I don't have to animate it with your faith and then actually suspend my disbelief and actually look at your worldview and contrast it with mine and do anything clever like that, or do anything responsible like that in terms of actual persuasion and negotiation and discourse. You just fundamentally reject discourse, and you're not using my semantic matrix. Therefore, I don't have to understand your position. I don't have to duplicate your understanding in my own mind. I just semantically sort of throw it out. It doesn't pass the semantic filter or something like that. So, that kind of semantic filter essentially is fundamentally very dangerous in and of itself in some sense. Because essentially it insulates a kind of abject relativism and sort of presumed self-righteousness. So it has no ability to check itself. It's an obtuse claim for a kind of total intellectual currency that nobody else can even speak up against until they've already completely conceded every point to your philosophical system. So they proceed from completely relativistic axioms that aren't capable of even having their own relativism invigilated by anything that doesn't already agree with them. So it's weirdly it's not self-referencing, but it's self-insulating, which I would say de facto is a kind of self reference. I mean, to be charitable to their position, they're not self-referencing; they're self-insulating, so that there's just no alternative to their position. So it's sort of, which is a weird kind of, so in effect it becomes something that's like self-referencing, but technically it's not. It's just that there's no, anyway, they can't step outside of their own worldview, essentially, to try something else. Okay, and that's all in the semantic claim, essentially. So they own the language, and their assault to unilaterally have dominion over the language is part of their general sort of in de facto self-referencing worldview, but it's in some sense just self-insulating. So it's sort of defensive, it's not substantively, because it doesn't actually, it fails to have a substantiation. So it can't be self-referencing because it doesn't substantiate itself. It just instigates a kind of blanket assault on everything that doesn't already agree with it. So it's weirdly sort of parasitic in that sense. It's sort of it's always blaming others for not already sort of plugging into its project, essentially. So there's the semantic project. That's the one leg of it. And then the other leg is basically the sociological planning. They have a plan that will solve the problem as they see it in their worldview. And so if and then they are equally as defensive of the sociological plan. And so if you raise other concerns or other issues, well, they're just not as important as they getting redress to the sociological issues as they see them, which can only be solved by their style and focus of their sociological planning. Now, what's interesting is that I mean, so I would call that this whole system is basically is a form of stupidity that has its own sort of particular, I mean, but it's a form of stupidity that is designed to maximize control. And it's interesting that if you can conflate problems of anything down to an ability not to control an outcome, which, I mean, you could reduce any problem down to that issue, is that, well, if you could just control the outcome, then uh, uh, you can essentially um, have at least some form of recourse potentially. I mean, hypothetically speaking, that's a way to, I don't want to say solve necessarily the problem, but that's a way to deal with the problem. Now, there's a problem with that in that when the only virtue about your worldview is that it hypothetically has an ability to control the problem, like, well, what is the cost of that form of control? And this is essentially what makes this whole worldview so fundamentally toxic, is that, you have to literally destroy everything. You have to destroy trust, human expressions of human decision making and choice and freedom and liberty all have to be ground up into the ideological narrative and the ideological scripting in order to provide the control that provides the sociological plan that delivers the redress. So you end up having to plug everyone into the sociological planning, and they can't run anything other than that software, or they can only run other things that are compatible with that. The problem is that, as I say, like, individual expressions of choice and decision making are not part of that. You're not allowed to actually have individualistically minded orientations, and it just doesn't mesh. It doesn't. They can't be included, or at least they can't be included any ones that go against the necessary sociological planning. Which, anyway, so the problem is, as well, is that the sociological planning is never translated into tangible things other than, let's say, direct redistribution or some kind of direct humbling of the scapegoat in some sense. Like, it's the redress that it always gears towards facilitating is essentially some form of vampirism, is some kind, which is, sort of has laden within it a fundamental inability to transform or to amend, as in make amends to people's so-called identity, because essentially people are not their identity. That essentially the sociological planning only functions if people really do identify as their group identity. And so, the fundamental mismatch between the group identity or the group entity, or the category system or whatever, and the individual is a bridge that essentially never gets mended, because the more you try to force that equivalency onto people as part of the sociological agenda and planning, fundamentally, the more you degrade them in some sense, the more you have to force them to take on some kind of tokenism or some kind of denigrating property is projected onto them, is foisted onto them. There's no way around that in some sense. They have to wear the narrative, and in some sense, the only way that you can sort of justify doing that to people, in some sense, this psychological self-disempowerment, is if somebody else is getting disempowered more and they are on the other side of the balancing sociological equation plan towards equilibrium. And so the only way to engineer equilibrium is by essentially extracting, let's say, a pound of flesh, and you consuming that pound of flesh, which, by the way, in this metaphor, turns you into a cannibal. That you so you have to somehow say that this form of vampirism or cannibalism is what justice means, or something like that, which means that you can't put down the identity, because the identity, which is in some sense the only thing that can excuse this base form of redistribution, essentially, which you have to say that the distribution of something that must hurt the thing that is being taken from, but the thing that must arrive from the taking is justice in the form of redistributed identitarian pride. So it's this transfer of pride. And so, justice becomes defined as the transfer of pride between identity groups. Which means that you can't forget the identity structure, and you end up having to create a kind of a cultish devotion to one's and a fundamental belief in a kind of categorical essentialism, because that's the only way to vindicate or to normalize or to moralize that kind of sociological planning. So you sort of you force people to live inside the narrative, and in some sense, if they ever try to graduate from that narrative, if they ever said, okay, well, enough is enough, now we've reached the reset point, now we can all just forget about it, it's not, that transitionary, action or whatever, you'll always find an excuse not to do it, in some sense, even as you try to work this mechanism. The sociological planning actually ends up being more disempowering, ends up sort of, because this whole construction of redistribution is fundamentally rotten, is fundamentally dehumanizing and disempowering, that it actually it aggravates all the problems in some sense. But anyway, but that's almost like a practical, or that's how it works in practice. Okay, so you've got the imperative of the sociological plan, which gets very hysterical, essentially. So you can say that, well, there's actually real hurt in the world and there's real damage, and we need to stop the damage by adopting the sociological plan, because it's the only thing that can alleviate the hurt pride, which is the psychological impetus that the system is hobbled by, which is perpetuating and permeating all of the different middling and low, it is the psychological nexus of all the real material damage that is happening. So it psychologizes. The sociological planning very strangely merges the field of collective psychology and a kind of materialism, sort of get concocted into, just a weirdly conflated, sort of mythological reproduction of reality. Okay, so that's really delusional in and of itself. And so you can always just amp that up, that essentially other people are causing all the sociological ill in the world by not adopting the sociological planning, which also is represented in the fact that they won't adopt the language code. They won't adopt the semantic matrix, which facilitates the sociological planning. And so both of these things are reflections of each other, but they are, let's say, separate tactics. So in some sense, the one is a way to speak over someone, in that you don't necessarily even have to interrupt them, but you can reinterpret their language because it doesn't make sense. It's all nonsense because those words, justice, doesn't mean what you think it means. Justice means what I think it means. So the relativism, the semantic relativism, essentially means that you can make nonsense out of anyone's utterances. And then the lack of the sociological planning is proof that they should already have adopted your semantic matrix. And so with these two parallel sources of equivocation, there's an infinite amount of internal regress that is possible between these two systems of projective control, as it were, or social manipulation. They both give you tools and instruments of essentially insulating yourself and also demanding control, the control represented by these instruments be acceded to by others, and that others must concede your strong feelings on this internal nexus of, okay, so these two things can sort of self-aggravate. You can, these things are almost like philosophical premises. So because these philosophical premises are such raw and vital subconscious belief structures that essentially work purely on the level of premise. They don't lead to rationale. That they can only be challenged on the level of how they operate as fundamental premises. So they already win the argument. They don't want to talk to you about their premises because they don't have good substantiations for these things. They're just sort of they just operate right from the start. And in fact, they're very upset if they have to argue any of their points, which is why whenever they are in some kind of debate or discourse, I mean, you can see this with any one of them that has ever tried to debate these things, they come off as a kind of comedian because they shouldn't even have to be arguing these points. And if you think that you're arguing against their superior, their morally superior, their innately morally superior position, then you've already, you haven't been let in on the joke. Like it already, semantically and sociologically, it's already self-gratifying, just from all of its premises. So they have to create, this kind of ostentatious display of superiority and mastery, and they have to treat you, like they always use this kind of diminutive tone, which is also the same kind of diminutive tone that they use when they have to dress up, their administrative action, which is very embarrassing. Like when you get these very strange, sort of ad hoc decision making that can't really substantiate itself. We think that you have contravened our standards. Well, do you think that, or have I actually contravened the standards? Like, how can it just be, like either I've contravened the standards or I haven't, and if I have, substantiate it. Don't tell me that you think that you've, in your opinion of, of something that, is, who is this we? The actual structure of the, they don't have a source of authority because it's just sort of, it's in the ether of all the categories of that sort of, it's by this cloud morality of that is sort of on behalf of the identity matrix. So it really it does have a strange nebulous moral grounding, which is so embarrassing and is built by these two premises that I've just tried to describe, these two different sets of premises, which are parallel to one another, the sociological planning and the semantic matrix that has the worldview already encoded into the semantics of it, that they can't defend them. They can only assume them to be correct and to essentially gainsay the content thereof. And so whenever you're actually in some kind of supposed discourse about them, or at least, debating them, ostensibly debating them, they can't debate them because they just are taken to be correct and true and to have no alternative. And because the sociological planning is imperative. And, essentially the semantic matrix thing is also, or as I say, it's kind of got nihilism within there, and sort of these the necessity of deconstruction, which means that, well, what do you base your moral outlook on? Well, you have to base it on some kind of abstract categorization of everyone's that you can sort of pretend that you're taking everything into account. But it's interesting because essentially all of their sort of strange philosophizing around, sort of how worldviews are themselves sort of products of, or sort of fundamentally ad hoc, or whatever, they end up creating a worldview which is fundamentally all the things that they criticize about, everybody else's, like everybody else, everything is relative. I mean, they can almost complain that everything is relativism, but somehow, because of some magic, they're not being relativistic when they accuse everything of being relativistic. It's sort of the accusation that everything is relativistic somehow makes you a unicorn that can just use whatever. If you have a language engine that is fueled on the assertion that everything is relativism, then somehow that language becomes, sort of as good as gold. And everybody else that isn't using a language engine that has its, as one of its premise, that everything is relativism, then it's not requisitely sophisticated. Rather than just saying, well, that whole basic outlook or angle of so-called sophisticated, erudite analysis is itself just an obtuse way of presenting a hard skeptical obstacle, and then saying, well, everything, if it doesn't pass this hard skeptical obstacle, then it's not worth constructing a formal system if you can't first deal with this problem. And so their abstract solution to this particular hard skeptical problem, which is in some sense the center of their idolatry, is that, well, the only way to overcome the relativism of everyone is to try to adopt the perspective of everyone in every category, or at least all the salient ones, or something like that. So, they've got even a self-contradiction there, because, how do they select which categories are salient? And, how do they know that their analysis of what itself is suppression and oppression is in fact the actual pertinent metric upon which to, because they're measuring interferences between the different categories. Well, how do they know that their category breakdown is the canonical and pertinent sorry, I'm trying to think of the adjective of discrete, but anyway. anyway, I mean, anyways, but suffice to say that it's fudged. Their whole intellectual enterprise is built on a fudging, where they haven't even overcome their own hard skeptical obstacle. But even if they would, like, why is that somehow a more relevant challenge? I mean, you know, because it's not even that they have displaced modernity, I would even say, or that they have replaced rationalism. I see their project as being exactly as rationalist. It's just that they've concocted a different gauntlet. That in some sense they have essentially supplemented the Enlightenment with just a different kind of conundrum, to, you know, a different formulation of a conundrum which they are essentially asserting is superior to that of reason and rationality. That they found a hard skeptical conundrum which the so-called resolution of which should be the universal sort of holy grail to the human condition, or at least to substituting for an engine that can power morality. Um, and in some sense, the only claim that they have backing that up is that, well, our semantic engine is connected with the sociological planning. So it's sort of, again, I won't call it self-referencing, but it's self-insulating, so that sort of nothing else claims to be able to do that in the way that it's doing it, or at least in a way that's hypothetically available for people to just easily sort of inculcate themselves within it and to latch onto it. But, you know, it's sort of like a massive sort of computer virus. Anyway, that is just replicated. Anyway, what is the main point here? So, to me, just going on and on about it having this semantic claim about having, let's say, its semantics are of a higher quality of epistemology. They have a higher epistemological force behind their semantic lexicon and their use of words and their particular jargon and the meaning of those words, which are essentially so that those words are taken and stolen from anyone who disagrees with them, so that no one who disagrees with them can use those words, or that those words can't be understood in any other way other than their semantic lexicon. And essentially because that is paralleled with their sociological planning. And their sociological planning is, anyway, so each of these things within themselves are circular reasoning. But when you have both of them operative within someone's mindset, you literally give them an infinite amount of pliability to ignore when you are, because the third thing that needs to be spoken about after all these things is reality itself. And I mean reality as also being informed or being, let's say, contended by individuals, and, let's say, pockets of shared reality in which individuals that comport to the same agreements about certain things, about certain beliefs, or about certain opinions, and certain rationale can share pockets and bubbles of shared reality that is, you know, ordinarily, let's say, negotiated or persuaded, you know, into creating shared reality spaces. Um, and reality itself, then, if you have these two parallel instruments of the sociological planning and the semantic relativism, you can create generalizations about subjects, about issues, about matters in the world that, are I don't know, so sort of dishonest, that essentially can pretend to be objective, but when it comes down to the issue essentially around morality, you know, some issues they laboriously, in very complicated issues, in very controversial matters, it's very interesting as to which are the segments of the issue that get elaborated, and which are the sections of the subject matter that get truncated and let's say generalized into cherry-picked, sort of reductions, like very obtuse and, undetailed descriptions. So, it's like retelling a story and, very egregiously elaborating some parts of the story that has been retold from multiple other sources that you've heard from, and then you piece these things together, and you very almost in a very contrived way, you elaborate some of the aspects, and you extremely truncate some of the other aspects, and you don't even let's say provide the contextual argument as to why you even do that. You just kind of you morally sentence within the reconstruction of the shared reality that is pieced together. And so you literally have a reality filter that is being powered by this very kind of pernicious relativism, but by the imperative of the sociological planning and the relativism of the semantic assumption of epistemological supremacy. And, those are essentially, I would just say, are engines of this very, another way of describing it is that you have such brittle and raw beliefs, subconscious beliefs, that are basically all function as premises that are so vulnerable to being disrupted and they're so close to the surface. The subconscious is so brittle and raw that, and it's so superficial. It as in, it has no depth. It operates very simplistically. It's so oversimplistic, in fact, that it can't even deal with details that break the mold of its very oversimplified moralistic, sort of sausage grinding. Everything has to be fed into this ideological sausage machine so that it grinds up reality to make something that is simple enough to comport with it's an ideological system that can only, this is a bit of a weak metaphor, but essentially it can only support, the consumption of sausages, and no other food it can be possible. Sorry, it's a bit of a strange metaphor, but and so it can't even construct it doesn't even have the ability to construct an opposing belief from, they can't even suspend their disbelief for a second because it's that brittle and visceral, and they have these two parallel parts of their subconscious belief system. Okay, so what else should I say about this? So anyway, I did just want to talk about reality as then, the need for them to reframe reality, to be able to radically recontextualize things, and it's very interesting why they can't actually debate people and argue people and persuade people into their position. It's just not capable, because it just operates on the level of the premise. They can't lead people through an argument. They can only sort of get to a point where they dictate a kind of unilateral reinterpretation of reality, and then they just pose that as an alternative worldview, because they can't actually create a bridge to their premises, because it doesn't operate as rationale. It operates only defensively in service of defending the premises and insulating the premises more from their very overt sort of assumption of sanctimonious veritude and I was going to say sort of correctness, and that essentially, yeah. So I mean, as I said, it's like you just have to swallow the pill of the sociological planning, or swallow the pill of the semantic relativism, and sort of when you've sort of swallowed both of those pills, then you've got a kind of immunity to any alternative reality, to even contending an alternative worldview. Because in some sense, it doesn't really have complicated beliefs. It has very simple beliefs in the semantic relativism and the sociological planning, because the one supports the other, and the other, yeah. So I mean, they both have, there's so much circular reasoning around that. So, and it's very easy for other people to disrupt that, essentially. I mean, it takes a lot out of them for them to listen to other people's perspectives that aren't coming in the pre-formulated, sort of baby formula that they need their reality morally depicted, because they're sort of their moral triggers and their moral sensibilities are, again, incredibly superficial and incredibly brittle and incredibly raw. And so you have to package things in those terms that are digestible. And so and they're so incapable of translating that oversimplified moral schema into sophisticated structures and processes that would ever, quite frankly, be conscionable to the dignity of individuals. It just, the dignity of individuals. I mean, I'll just give a tangible thing, and this came up talking with Iron Sun, and this reminded me, because I have spoken about this in my recordings a long time ago, but I really wanted to bring this up again, because he kept on bringing this topic up, and I didn't talk about it directly, but it is an interesting topic. But essentially, how, I mean, he gave a particular example and a particular story about this, and so I might not be talking about the topic exactly how he was raising it, but anyway, I think that this touches on what he was talking about, where essentially feminism, for instance, is basically hinged on removing from men their capacity to express a personal preference or to express their own structure of free choice of belief and what they're interested in, or something like that. It's stripping down the ideological scapegoat from its capacity to make decisions and free choices, and instead their perception, which is even molded by sort of the inherent original sin of the system, or whatever, the systemic oppression or whatever it may be, needs to be displaced by an ideological adjustment, by an ideologically entrained script, which will mediate the imbalance within the identity matrix. And so, somewhat the idea is that only the perpetrators, or the category of perpetrators, need to adjust, and in some sense the category of the victims need to take up the redistributed space that is offered to them when the perpetrators are having to retrain themselves according to the ideological supplementation of their free decision making, and in some sense they need to actually change their planning. They must adopt the sociological planning of an ideological trust, so that they don't trust their own sensibilities, their own discerning. They can't understand things. They must instead understand according to what the ideology needs from them, in order to make room for the social justice. So it's sort of like this idea that only the perpetrators can induce the agency of victims to be reinvigorated and restored, or something like that. But that it's such a strange, I mean, there are all these sort of weird mystical, but like we don't even know the layers of the oppression that we have, because we've had people suppressed for so long that we don't even know what society would even be like if they weren't oppressed, or something like that. So you have this kind of, you're working against, just to use some strange phrases which they always use, like, it's almost like the KKK with all their magic bullshit of grand dragon viziers and weird, sort of other kooky bullshit, that, that the epistemological injustice that, how is, like, well, how do you know how much the truth has been, that the truth has been impoverished by, sort of, it's incalculable. Well, if the truth has been damaged, I mean, who knows what its vindication would even look like? So you're literally operating in a field in which, you're fundamentally, by the whole fudging of the framework and the worldview, is fundamentally blind. Is blind to know when it's finished. And even while they try to solve it the way that they're trying to solve it, they end up making everyone worse off, and debilitating the system. And in some sense, just what's weird is that I do actually think that they do actually succeed in terms of the identitarian feelings. I think they do generally succeed. I think that they have elevated the pride of some identitarian imperialist sentiment. They have increased sort of the identity categories that they seek to empower, have been emboldened. That those identity categories have been emphasized and accorded extra prestige and extra prominence that they otherwise wouldn't have culturally had. and the cultural identities that they wish to denigrate have also been, as a collective entity, as a cultural social construct or whatever. I think those things have been denigrated. So they have actually achieved that cultural benchmark or milestone or whatever. It's just that it's utterly useless. And in fact, how useless that cultural project has been, how utterly empty and hollow that achievement, what has it gotten? What has happened? It sort of it in some sense. I mean, I guess it moves towards agitating towards a more radical form of it, but or to express itself more radically. So in some sense, it's very similar to the same kind of sentiments that were cultivated leading up to the Nazi takeover of Weimar Germany. Um, because I mean, you must remember that Hitler, people knew the kind of propaganda that Hitler, was using in Germany. People, knew the content of his speeches all over the world. Hitler was the most popular leader in Europe before the war. Everyone knew about him, and he was very, very popular in many countries before the war. Some people sort of knew how dangerous and dark, that species of ideology was, but those were by far not the majority. It's very similar to the cultural things that we're living through today, in that you're not going to have a Hitler in every country. You're not going to have an identitarian rise up and represent in every country, but so I mean, I probably live in the country where if there is going to be a fascist advent, it's going to be in South Africa, most probably. That's where the conditions are also much more similar with Weimar Germany. Weimar Germany similarly did very crazy things, because of essentially almost the social justice propaganda, which was essentially that the state should try to find jobs for people. And so the state did all these unsustainable economic things in order to, they created factories. The politicians incentivized people to just build factories, and they built all these factories, and they had nothing to manufacture in the factories, which actually turned out very good for the war, because then they had all this extra industrial capacity for the war. But in the same way, we have affirmative action and black economic empowerment, which is essentially I would say, is the equivalent to that. That you politically are compelled to do things, or by the rhetoric that's being thrown around, that makes the situation even worse. That doesn't actually, it's sort of, you're doing the thing that is actually exacerbating, because you're pandering to the wrong ideology, you're pandering to the wrong sociological planning that is trying to control the effect rather than trying to maximize the process that would tend towards naturally, organically creating the thing that you supposedly want, that the sociological planning is supposedly aiming and targeting to arrive at. And the more energy you put into the sociological planning, the more self-disempowering you get, the more crazy everything is, that you turn what should be economic business decisions into decisions that hinge on this weird cult of social psychology, that no, we need to upgrade people's psychology, and that's how we have inclusive growth. It's just this ideological mess of a bundle of just hollow rhetoric that facilitates wholesale mismanagement and corruption. Because also the redistributive imperative essentially means that you have to give something to a token at the end of the day. It's not organic. It doesn't make sense within the market. And instead of trying to actually focus on the supply side, instead of saying, okay, how do we get more students that we want to include in higher education? How do we get them to meet the requirements so that they can be admitted? Instead, they lower the requirements for certain groups of people, and therefore creating mismatches and creating horrible wastages and horrible disparity in people's skills, and you end up creating horrible inequality that is in a way also then being reproduced by this failure of a lack of serious transformation, because it's all based on control and not based on the fidelity of the process, because fidelity and trust has all been displaced by this ideological prescription that everyone must just be conscripted into the identitarian matrix, and the anyway. So I don't know if I have exactly the courage at this moment to talk about religious aspects, but I'll just make a very short comment about this. Now, what I'm about to say, I think, might not be true in all variants of Islam. But to me, the most worrying aspect of some forms of Muslim belief is that they too have this, let's say, relativism. That they have both a semantic relativism and they also have a sociological plan, and in some sense, the general understanding of Islam itself. And I myself question if, and I know that this is, you're not even supposed to say, an Islamic scholar that might even believe what I'm about to say, you're not allowed to say this. It's impossible to make this utterance. Is that I wonder if in the Sunni Shia civil war that happened immediately after the Prophet's death, that if Islam wasn't perhaps corrupted into this form because it facilitated a level of control, but essentially the generalization of Islam is that it's a sociological plan. And because it is a sociological plan, it doesn't matter how intelligent it is or how it's understood, as long as it's understood that in the long run it facilitates peace and the requisite control over the sociological issues, which can themselves also not be properly understood because it's not needed to be understood. It just needs to be understood that Islam is the solution to it. And let me just tell you the overarching issue around control, which generally goes into the problem is that I think a good definition of intelligence is the capability of solving problems. So if we say intelligence is your ability to solve a problem, when you add time into that, you can get a paradox around intelligence, because in the long term you can always solve a problem by turning it into, through the course of time, into an issue of control. You can say, well, the problem is solved if in the long term we control it. So we don't have to understand, we don't have to have the intelligence in the present to directly tackle and solve a problem, if in the long run we can control the issue. So we trade the immediate ability to solve a problem or to tackle a problem head on with a long-term issue of control, which is not the same problem. But you could say that that is a way to deal with the problem. So you can turn a problem into an issue of control, which is in some sense not the same problem, it's a different problem. And this is the difference between understanding and knowledge, is that you can know how to control an issue, but you don't have the intelligence to solve it in the present, but you can control it over the long term. Anyway, this is an interesting juxtaposition to think about. And so this is the problem also with social justice, is that hypothetically over the long term, the issue of control can mean that you don't need any intelligence. You don't need any moral intelligence, because in the long term, the moral insight, the moral question is displaced by the ability of the ideology to control the outcome. Problem is that the process, I would say, has no fidelity and no real intelligence, and it is antithetical to developing real intelligence and a real understanding. And I do think that there are, generally speaking, versions of Islam which are fundamentally in that valence. They are using the same strategy. They are using the same formula, as it were, with a parallel semantic relativism and a sociological plan. And that is a dangerous paradox that can hypothetically solve any problem. But I would say that it's not really solving the problems with any level of fidelity, or any level of fidelity that can be understood, other than just using a semantic engine and a sociological plan that together sort of infinitely reinforce each other. Okay, so and it's interesting that this, I mean, I'll say as well that, I mean, there's some issues in this world which they really upset me, because I don't like how in the history and the detail that happens around an issue, some of it is explored and other parts of it are ignored. And, some of the history and some of the surrounding details are relevant, and other surrounding details and history and the importance of actually having to deal with things in the present that arise, and actually having to do things in the present in the context of also, let's say, unfortunate historical subtexts. But there's difference between, let's say, a context that needs to be, I mean, I don't know. Should I go into this? I mean, this is going to. So, let me talk about the current Palestinian-Israeli thing. To me, I don't know if I'm abridged of all the facts, but I'll just tell you what I find to be strange and slightly disgusting. Is that when people talk about this recent conflagration and how it escalated and what happened in the events, people get, at least the people that I've heard from the Palestinian side, or at least people that speak on behalf and on defense of how the Palestinians have been treated, they do not speak about why the evictions in East Jerusalem were taking place. They do not talk about the details or the necessity of that. They somehow, they start in the middle of the story. Oh, well, these people were being evicted because of ethnic cleansing. I mean, I've even heard that essentially suggested. That, I think, is overtly dishonest. Now, in some sense, the context can be set up very emotively, because East Jerusalem is itself occupied land. So then is the problem that, the Israeli courts on some level should not have the authority to verify the eviction notices that went out against these people who didn't pay their leases or their rent or whatever it's called. And would then the solution to that then be that all occupied territory should have a supra judicial body looking after it, so that when these eviction notices go out in the future, it's not an Israeli court that can be blamed for essentially being an agent of ethnic cleansing by the media, because essentially, anyway, I mean, that could be a way to avoid this problem. But I also think that framing is itself strange and weird, and so to me, that is the most weird and strange aspect of this particular mounting escalation. Because eviction notices that were probably precipitated by a civil court and not a, you know, well, I mean, I guess, I expect that the courts in Israel are essentially like non-partisan Western level sort of fidelity, institutions that they that the law itself is also reasonably constructed. Anyway, I mean, I should, if I'm going to bring it up, I should actually spend more time setting it up and talking about this. But the ability for people to generalize issues into a greater narrative, into some kind of reduction, where everything merges into an oversimplified, sort of drama, instead of actually tracking, the actual fidelity of, I guess, you can say, well, the context itself is fundamentally rotten, or the context itself is fundamentally unjust, and it needs rectification, or something like that. I mean, for me, I always just say, okay, well, let's just say everything is morally questionable. What is the situation on the ground? And what is the steel-manned position of both sides, where things should go, and how things exist in the present? And that gives you essentially three versions of which to try to homogenize, and of which to try to coalesce into a negotiated set of conditions to transition towards some kind of agreed upon destination. And when I try to do that with this conflict, I look at the sentiments, I look at the strongest claims and everyone's version of their strongest claims. And fundamentally, to me, it comes down to the fact that the Palestinian side, the so-called Islamic side, has got sentiments that are somewhat baked into a semantic relativism and a sociological plan which is fundamentally incompatible with any kind of bridge building or homogenization or anything like that. Okay, this is an addendum. There were some elements which I would just like to talk about more, and emphasize. Hopefully I can cover them without it being sort of too embarrassing or too much repetition. So one of the elements that I didn't bring out essentially is in borderline personality disorder, there is, sort of this property of identity dysregulation, or having a dysregulated identity. And I'm going to say that the cause of this, of identity dysregulation, is that you don't have feedback, you don't have negotiation about your own identity. You have a unilaterally controlled, asserted identity. And my general argument is that identity politics and the kind of the structure of it, of having semantic claims that facilitate disregarding any alternative input, so being able to essentially disregard any alternative view, and in some sense the semantic claim with its parallel sociological planning, which is also somewhat a kind of unilateral assertion that other people are responsible for the lack of justice, or that they are providing the kind of negative pressure that is suppressing, some kind of victim identity. Which, I mean, this is also true on the semantic claim side, is that these words like justice and all the good labels that get sort of just unilaterally appropriated are all hinged on this weird kind of paradox that the identity is everything and anything good, and has essentially been disrupted by an external scapegoat, which should be equal in prestige to the victim identity. And so you've got this terrible sort of epistemological parasitism that that is all hinged on accusations against the scapegoat, which are in some sense all components of a reactive mentality, that then have to keep their basic. The whole thing is that these mechanisms are so simple, they're so concise and simplistic in how they conceptually function, that you're kind of crushing even the bandwidth that people have in order to think in a more comprehensive way, in a more cohesive sense of actually having to mediate between other people's senses of reality. You can just disregard that because your view represents a whole matrix of identities, which is an abstraction of speaking for everyone in the identity matrix, and which is essentially got so much defensive armor around even considering other perspectives that come from individuals, that you just have this automatic parasitism on other people's expressions of what reality is. You can just override it automatically. And so I mean, it also disguises the basic sort of paradox at the core of the identity, that essentially this identity, the victim identity, should have no standards applied to it, while all the standards that have to do with the cause of the complaining and the grievances should be opposed against the identity of the scapegoat. And there's no negotiation sort of between this polarized, hyperbolic sort of moral panic and moral emergency. And so essentially there's no alternative to the unilateral exclusive reality that services the ideological planning and the semantic, sort of gainsaying and claims as to, what things really mean. Anyway, just the unilateral nature of that overarching style of relating to disagreement, which in some sense, it never actually confronts a disagreement. It just creates deflective, defensive boundaries to protect its very visceral and raw and brittle sort of claims that sort of formulate its semantic sensibility and awareness and its sociological planning, which, okay, so anyway, okay, I'm just kind of repeating myself now, but that is all to just say that this disposition of how it regards identity and the conundrum that is sort of insulated within the identity and the weird kind of paradox there is so raw and sensitive because it's so hinged on this kind of accusation against a scapegoat. But then it's also incapable of defining itself, because if it did define itself positively, rather than defining itself negatively in the pressure that it feels from the scapegoat, this is another way of saying that the sociological planning is an unbounded, open-ended, never-ending, sort of metric. That, they pretend it's fudge, that, obviously, so they're always treating their interlocutor, that's, if they're in something that ostensibly looks like a debate, as, someone who just doesn't get common sense, or that obviously, like, they would feel and know when the reset point was reached between the identities, and it's just a simple, sort of metric utilitarian calculation. Never minding, sort of the huge cost and the huge amount of disempowerment and how they never arrive at any reset point, because whenever they get a hold of policy, they just make everything worse. Because they don't focus on the process of arriving at an outcome, they only focus on the outcome itself. They substitute intelligence with control. And, it's the same thing as sort of pandering to a borderline's deranged, sort of morality plays and, sort of distortion of reality, because, there's so little sophistication that it can take account of. There's so little nuance that it can actually, the only nuance that it can understand is how it has to sort of gerrymander reality and have reality filters in order to keep its morality operative. And make sure that it doesn't sort of suspend its own disbelief in any alternative. It is almost like an addiction, I would say. Anyway, so when I was talking in my last recording, that this is an addendum to, I perhaps slightly misspoke when I said, I should have said, there's the semantic claims that they make as to, what words actually mean, according to their lexicon. I said too quickly, it's semantic relativism. That's sort of that's the conclusion that you have to draw after the points, but essentially that the semantic claims that they make are only grounded in their own relativism, and that relativism basically makes them unable to regulate their own identity, essentially. And so you have people that are essentially becoming more and more deranged, in that they can only define themselves within the project of perpetrating or deploying this ideological program and project, which comes, in the form of sort of these two pillars of sort of this very reactive mentality of using a kind of semantic claim and using a sociological planning that they are advocating essentially. And yeah, there's an identity dysregulation built into that. And so they are normalizing borderline um, uh, the borderline structure of identity dysregulation. Although the added issue here, and this is what makes it somewhat manifest, I would say, as narcissism, because it almost seems like a collective narcissism as well, or is that technically it's the identity that is borderline. And then there is a kind of people, in some sense, inherently know that they are not the same thing as the identity, that the identity is a category that connects them with other people. And so because of that potential bridge of togetherness, because of that abstraction, you can sort of plug yourself into a mode of borderline personality disorder, but you're adopting it as a garb, as you're dressing up into it, and it's fundamentally some kind of performance. And I would say that is the same kind of performance that the narcissist has with the false self. And so I would say that the adherents of this kind of ideological project are more like narcissists than they are like borderlines. I mean, it's complicated because there's an abstract crossover. Because if you want to look at how the identity itself is functioning, the identity itself, I would say, is borderline. But obviously, you're not talking to identities; you're talking to individuals that claim to represent identity categories or fit inside the identity matrix. And so being able to speak on behalf of that matrix, anyone who does that, in some sense, the Führer, the actual, the people who set themselves up as guardians of the identity, are actually trying to channel the borderline element of the whole ideology. Whereas generally the followers and the adherents, I would say, are the flying monkey element is a kind of collective narcissism, using almost in a very cold and calculated way, using the intellectual structure to use as a kind of a sadistically edged, because it tries to use itself as a shield that, no, you need to protect yourself from the evil scapegoat. And so you can use what is ostensibly a defensive reactive mentality in order to disrupt other people's personal preferences, cutting them off from their own reality and incepting them into, a reality in which the rules are set up. And as long as you can kind of invoke and frame reality, you can end up sort of, I mean, this is the thing is because it doesn't, depending on how you set it up, you can sort of force the outcome, because it is, it's oversimplified and it's sloppy. So depending on how you kind of establish the framework of presenting the narrative, you can get opposite prescriptions out of the same supposed ideology. That's how sort of weak and relativistic it fundamentally is. That, and that comes to do with the nebulousness of the identity itself. That essentially it's only fundamentally defined by the negative pressure of the scapegoat, and it needs to rely on essentially accusations against the scapegoat. And because those accusations are essentially not mutually exclusive, you can always um, uh, you can get terrible contradictions. You can get people that are leveraging the same accusations against each other, and they're essentially both right, and there's no way to sort of mediate between the two, um, except for some mob group think that there's a totem pole or something like that of precedence or hierarchy. Um, anyway, let me just think if there was another point that. So yeah, I mean, oh yeah, I mean, this is also to echo an important point that Good Mother always brings up, is essentially the dishonesty. And so the narrative that the sociological planning and that the sort of the parasitism that is at the core of the semantic claims as well, that every label that is appropriated is somewhat leveraging something being accused of being a perpetrator. That's sort of what gives um, the semantic claim its weight and its importance, and as to why it can't be overlooked, or why an alternative semantic structure must just be automatically disregarded and displaced, because otherwise, we're not going to deal with the injustice. Um, that the narrative that is containing that mythology and that sort of simplistic way of looking at things is going to have truncated pertinence. Is going to have shortcuts. Some details get trimmed, and other details sort of get elaborated in order to sort of fit the bill of the necessity of the structure, um, of the ideology. And you'll if you track that dishonesty, uh, you see how it sort of gets doubled down on. um, Sorry, I'm not doing justice to this exact point, but you know in some sense it becomes very conspicuous that the whole system has no first principles, it just has claims. And because it doesn't have first principles, that it sticks to, it just has kind of aphorisms, or sort of hollow sounding, sort of uh, phrases which are formally being complied with, which are almost just like sort of blind sentimentality, um, of in some sense it's more sort of semantic gain, saying that, look, we are doing these amazing phrases, are what we stand for. And it's just a way of furthering, this kind of this shell game of dishonesty, of um, labeling something, and there being so much latent dishonesty within it, and further sort of narrative dishonesty, and reframing things in order to preserve the viability of their general project. I mean, the baby that gets lost in the bathwater does get more and more unworkable and dehumanizing. In that, people essentially have to be tokens. They can't be individuals. They can't operate, without the crutch of this kind of ideological identity dysregulation, which gives them the kind of nebulousness, which is sort of cast as the freedom that they need to grow into, while other people are limiting their, are being segregated out of the system of power that has been suppressing them, and so you're just sort of fawning over and spoon feeding a kind of a so-called sort of damaged identity, so that it can sort of become more malevolent, and then label that malevolence as a kind of as a necessary justification to rectification to the system. Because in some sense its lack of principles and its lack of fidelity and trust and honesty in any kind of authentically negotiated way essentially can only vindicate itself by perpetrating sort of transgression and damage and malevolence, and then labeling those things as good. Because if you can sort of do something that is kind of ironic, if you can be disruptive to what is the common conventional sensibility, then it's proof that your ideology is sort of being transformative in some profound way. So it's sort of, it comes from the merger of psychology and a social psychology with, let's say, material constraints and material complaining. So you say, oh, the problem is poverty, or the problem is a disparity in some material outcome, or in some cultural prestige. So the more damage that you can do in supposedly facilitating a disruption to common sense, or to how things function, the more radical the thing that you can get away with. Um, uh, uh, in terms of redrafting radically, but sort of the more macabre you can be, and the more sort of radically transgressive and violent, and sort of the more horrific the the in some sense you're flirting with the idea of getting or rendering some a rigorous so I'm trying to think of a word that just means solidity. The more you're floating with the idea that you're going to start to see the actual emergence of a concrete identity that is no longer nebulous, that is sort of reaching the end of the reset point, because you can actually start to see like what it was that was being suppressed by the system, or whatever. That the sort of the magic spell is getting close to its end, and that social justice will actually be arrived at, or something like that. And it's sort of, I mean, this is just a kind of, this is a self delusional. I mean, this is in some say in some way this is very much like a borderline personality disordered person having a complete psychotic uh, episode. It's which is always in some sense facilitating a very stringent form of needing to feel in control, and its grasping for control is just essentially it's got so many contradictions and erroneous assertions built into the current narrative that it's trying to place in power, and revel in the control that it's exerting over its environment, while it's sort of unraveling itself because under the weight of its own contradictions. And in some sense, you can see that that's where you get this kind of inbred psychopathy within the identitarian movement, that in some sense it's searching for an externally imposed boundary. It's almost like a kind of an immature child that is looking for an authority figure to dispense to it a kind of infantilism and a kind of prescription. It's getting, it's becoming a more overt demand for a Führer. Essentially, it is the burgeoning of a fascistic culture in which you need to have a giant icon, a giant mascot for the identity that is speaking for the identity, and sort of that in some sense it's begging for a Führer principle. It's moving towards outlining the need for having a kind of a magical grand dragon wizard, a sort of leader, which is kind of the kind of thing that you get in the KKK sociological sort of pecking order and political structure of its executive, of its leadership, which is essentially the role that Hitler played within the Nazi philosophy and the Nazi cultural. Anyway, is that everything that I wanted to go over? Yeah, so I mean, the real problem is that the identity category is by necessity, it is nebulous, because it's hinged on essentially the necessity of and the imperative of imposing the semantic claim and the sociological planning, which is all hinged on essentially victimhood, which is essentially that it's hinged on selling a slave morality and sort of not being able to confront the world other than through that valence of analysis, through that issue that needs to be controlled for, or needs to sort of be reacted to. Yeah, I mean, I guess the theme that is playing out, I think, in all this sort of philosophy is that that it's all hinged on a kind of parasitism on people's authentic expressions of their personal free choices and decision making and trust, that they can't trust things as individuals. They can't, in culture, signify what they trust and what they prefer and express their actual desires. They're not allowed, I would say famously, this all comes from men being deprived of interacting freely in the sexual marketplace and being dictated to that no, you can only be interested in things that are ideologically approved and ideologically prescribed, because that is the solution to the systemic oppression that women live under, or something like that. So it's sort of like that you can dictate to people what their preferences should be, and what is culturally okay for them to voice, or something like that. And so this is kind of a stupid example, but a lot of when you already live in a liberal democratic society, which is, I think, the best kind of, when you live in a liberal democracy, as in that it's focused around libertarian principles and values in the law itself, you can't do better than that. In that yes, some people are going to feel like what is popular within culture is going to negatively affect their lives, whereas, like they could imagine a culture in which their interests and passions or curiosities had more so-called acceptance or popularization. I mean, the best example that I can sort of give of this is that, like, let's just imagine that people's sexual preferences are metaphorically similar to their favorite color, and that everyone, this is a hypothetical thought experiment. Everyone wears their favorite color as the T-shirt that they always wear. And let's just say you live in a society where 95% of the people's favorite color was yellow, and 5% of people's favorite color was blue. And let's then just also say, as part of the thought experiment, that if you are wearing a color that other people aren't wearing, that it fundamentally makes your color stick out in an unattractive way, and therefore it seems to diminish the it reflects badly, that it would look better if it was more homogeneous or something like that. Now that's just an inconvenient outcome that you can't rectify. You can't solve that. If people, I mean, I guess I have to build this into the. I was just about to sneeze, and I was trying to pause the recording. Anyway, you can't, uh, you know, I guess as part of my thought experiment, I'd have to put into the example that no one says that you have to make your the color of the shirt that you're wearing, your favorite color, but sort of people prefer to do that because it's their favorite color, and therefore and they can freely choose how to dress, and that is the uh and I mean, I guess I can justify. I mean, this is a bit of a crazy thought experiment, but let's just say that it's like practicing. Like, people would prefer to practice the sexual orientation that they prefer, that they believe that they have, and that they prefer. So if you say that's like, obviously then people would not wear the shirt that they don't, um, that isn't their favorite color, in the same way that people wouldn't practice a sexual orientation that they don't prefer. And that really is the kind of psychological penetration that identity politics is sort of overriding, when, in some sense, you're supposed to overlook this because it only affects some section of the population, that, sort of, that doesn't affect women. That prescription is only put onto men and men's sexual expression of what they prefer. So already it plays this game where it's divided up people into where some people can sort of enjoy the nebulousness which is created out of the potential of the weight of their accusation, which other people have to be burdened by and have to have their preferences um, and trust, sort of dislocated from themselves and unilaterally dictated to, or through some kind of reality filter, that makes extra room for other people to feel less pressure to explore and to be curious. So it's this kind of vampiric, parasitic version of freedom. And the idea that you can kind of redistribute kind of cultural liberty and freedom in a kind of in the set design way in which it's taken from one identity category and given to another, because there's something morally significant about the categories themselves. Is a weird kind of dislocation in consciousness that plugs itself into a weird kind of iconography, which is in some sense so dehumanizing and superficial, and in some sense confusing what is morally vital and important about the individual and throwing it into this vat of sort of labels and semantics. And as I said, it can really pretend to be moralistic in its project, because, as I said, you can transmutate any issue of actually solving a problem into the issue of control. And that's what they've done, is that they've extended morality into the hypothetical control of the future. And they're doing it with, well, if people just change their interpretation of reality, if people just allow their interpretation of reality to be supplemented for by these kinds of these structural compensatory mechanism of redistribution of power. Essentially because they have translated discerning and intellect and actual honest judgment, as it were, and an honest consciousness of something, being able to trust something, being able to look at something and to think something about it. They have translated that all into a kind of uniform power, that these are all expressions of power that come from the identity, and that moral consideration is all about how identities are treated, not about how the process of individual decision making. So they have sort of subtracted they have subtracted and abstracted moral consideration from actual human consciousness, and they have given it over to essentially these a pantheon of idolatry, called identity categories, with the so-called moral investment that, well, if we use these things as our metrics, as we can, in the long term, we can control for, we can compel outcomes. We can impose diversity and parity and equity. We can impose equality between these categories when they're not important categories, essentially. Especially when you remove the process of living and the process of thinking from them. When you've set up these things that no, well, these people, they can't understand one another, because if they did understand one another, then you would be destroying their unique differences, and essentially they're not the same because of history or something like that. And so you've got all this dogma around a kind of inherited fatalism that is all bound up into the identity, that is all packaged. I mean, why should it be packaged in the identity and not in more specific, generic problems that everyone and anyone can face? Why it's not, why you don't define oppression as a non-racial set of issues, and deal with it in the present, when you can deal with it in some kind of long-term issue of control and compulsion over a system. So it's a way of generalizing a problem into a false reduction through levers of false equivocation and false equivalences and circular reasoning, which then sort of creates this disgusting fascistic culture and society that we see emerging. Okay, I think I've probably repeated myself enough. Just trying to think if I've... Let me just go over my notes one more time. And in some sense, the fundamental dishonesty is in the double standards that they rely on. That without double standards, they don't have any principles. They only have sort of the latent dishonesty that is bound up in the double standards that they keep on relying on and trying to impose as the solution to controlling for the outcome that they ostensibly and you can see the kind of... There's a very interesting example in my country at the moment where the ruling party, which has a lot of this crazy ideology built into it and the critical race theory, which is very helpful for their corruption and all this kind of stuff, but you can just see the kind of the logical games that are played around certain things, like the ruling party created this rule for themselves where they say that if anyone is charged with corruption, that they have to step aside from their post while they are being investigated for corruption. Not after they've been convicted, but just while they are charged and under investigation, they need to step aside from their post. Obviously, this makes sense when you are a political organization where you have to care about your image to voters. It obviously makes sense to have a step-aside rule. Not also because, not even to mention the necessity to step aside from important positions of executive power, which can influence the government potentially. You don't want to give people the tools to circumvent the systems and structures of investigation and justice. It's sort of it's a way to sort of to safeguard impartiality of swift and equal justice. So if you just want to sort of pragmatically say that the ANC is not just any organization, it's an organization that is in power in government, and if people are going to still have their governmental important positions, that they could have influence over the process of justice being promulgated in their case. So there are purely good practical reasons to have a step-aside rule. Now, the ANC itself says within its constitution and its structures, it actually commits itself to the principle of innocent until proven guilty. And the Secretary General, who is being charged with corruption, investigated and being investigated with corruption, that didn't want to step aside, is now challenging this rule of the step-aside rule because it doesn't comply with innocence until proven guilty, that it's not justifiable in a democracy or something like that. Now, this is a completely hollow argument. It's a strange thing to say that, well, your innocence is being the status of being innocent is being the step aside rule itself is not a punishment. It's not a sentence of it's not a conviction of criminality. So if it's not a punishment and it's not a conviction, a criminal conviction in and of itself, how is your status of being innocent being contravened? I mean, if you're going to say, it doesn't say that you are untouchable until being proven guilty. It says you are innocent. The status of your innocence has not been, the idea of step aside, I imagine, is that you don't lose the position when you step aside. You step aside, and if you are cleared, then you are reinstated. So, in some sense, your position has not been lost if you step aside. So, the idea that innocence until proven guilty is being contravened by an organization having its own administrative process functioning, and having a rule that means that people that are still innocent and have not been convicted are actually, going through a practical alteration in their status, which is, let's say, even a somewhat necessary. You can see how the kind of the semantic gainsaying here. Well, if I have to step aside, then I'm not being treated as if I'm innocent. I mean, that is a non sequitur. I don't think that that's necessarily true at all. Being compelled to step aside because that is how the rules function, and that's what the rule says. Well, that means that if you don't like the rules that your organization has, then you should use the processes within an organization in order to protest those rules within the structure that the organization has for that kind of protest, or you should resign because if you morally are of the opinion that a rule if it is your opinion that a rule unjustifiably contravenes, the innocence until proven guilty principle, then you're either in the wrong organization or you're in an organization where there's a difference of opinion. But just being able to say that you can viably hold the opinion that this rule contravenes innocence until proven guilty doesn't mean sufficiently that it does, just because it does in your opinion. I'm saying that it could validly be in someone's opinion that this rule does contravene it, but I don't think that you can prove that reasonably beyond any doubt. I think that it's a I mean, I'll say, to be as charitable, I think it's controversial. I mean, I personally disagree, but I can understand that there can be personal disagreement about it. But then if you have personal disagreements about, the rules of an organization, then you're either in the wrong organization, you're in an organization that or you're in an organization in which, you need to hold a controversial view that is different to the position of the rules that govern that organization. I mean, I guess you could still be in an organization that has rules that you disagree with, and that you canvass people against, or something like that, or that you wish were changed. If you do so within the structures that facilitate that. But to pull this out, when it affects you, I think is to make a specious argument. Is also, just because an argument can be contended, logically, that it could be a real opinion that someone has, doesn't mean that it's correct. It doesn't mean that it should be vindicated, that opinion should be vindicated by a court. Uh, just because it's a possible interpretation doesn't mean that it should be the governing judgment on the issue and on the matter, especially when there are good reasons for having an administrative process, an administrative action of having a rule enforced that is something like the step aside rule. Anyway, because obviously stepping aside is not a criminal conviction and it's not a punishment. It's born of practical and pragmatic necessity for a political organization, I would even say, and especially a political organization that is in power and a ruling party. So, those are ample substantiations and justifications for having such a rule, and for why such a rule has got nothing to do with impugning the innocence of someone, or but it is interesting because I think that this is the kind of specious arguments and specious sort of rationalization that you get. That's the kind of sort of cherry picking, a cherry picked reality filter. Excuse me. That people, I think, get addicted to being able to make generalizations that are convenient for their position. Because essentially their disposition must just always be in this kind of channel of dictatorial, unilateral control over reality. And there's always a kind of rhetorical, moral excuse machine of what is more pertinent, and it's always just abrogating these moral labels to your own position. As I said, it essentially, it's so semantically hinged that it's essentially grounded only in its own relativism. And that kind of relativism is a kind of addiction, and it does have a kind of weird identity dysregulation to the point at which you can actually believe that it's about, oh, well, this is all about innocence until proven guilty. You can actually, you can sort of almost table thump your way into believing that is what it's all about. That justice becomes semantically etched into a definition that essentially has no understanding attached to it. It's allergic to the understanding of any first principles. Instead, it just has some sort of basic assertion that is beyond any invigilation or questioning. And that is why I think narcissists like this ideology, and they like the normalization of this kind of sadistically edged, defensive, reactive mentality things, is because they can just pick up any old logical implement and leverage it and use it to get their way, because they can just say, well, that's what the word means. That's what innocence means. Innocent means that I don't get touched, that nothing, which is an overextension of the word innocence. Being forced to be step aside because it's a rule in an organization does not stop you from being considered innocent. It's not a conviction. It's not a punishment. It's, in some sense, you could say it's a political necessity on some level for a governing party. For a political organization that is a ruling party to have officials that get to keep their high-powered positions, that have the ability to have reach and influence over the prosecuting authority. I mean, this is essentially why it's never been possible to sort of dismantle the patronage networks and the chains of corrupt politicians and the careerists in the ANC. And also why probably still the majority of them will not will not be able to be dislodged. It would be so much easier to reform the ANC if they actually lost an election, and literally had to, out of political necessity, renew their party. But anyway, we live in a country with a level of racialist politics that is so successful that in some sense is so emboldened by the sort of the identity politics fashion being broadcast over and normalized in the culture, that South Africa really is like the Weimar Germany of the 1920s. Anyway, this is depressing enough. This is yet another addendum. So I'm just going to emphasize the point about dishonesty and about using parasitically other people's expressions of their own individual preferences or decision making or choices, or in terms of expressions of independently derived planning and trust that is coming from an independent node of consciousness that is making its own decisions, that is what is parasitically being used to fuel a kind of the whole sort of ideological semantic gainsaying and the sociological planning that gets sort of hyperbolically sensitive about not being adhered to, or its prescriptions not being automatically adopted and acceded to. This expectation that you just must bend the knee because the stakes are too high, the moral panic is too great. But you see, when you can use the scapegoated category of identity, the perpetrator identity, as essentially this kind of fuel source and this kind of ideological resource, it sort of fuels the nebulous nature of the victim identity, of the oppressed identity, then gains this kind of latitude of creativity, which is fueled on, let's say, the counterfactual perpetration of the social injustice which comes from the perpetrator identity. And this, sort of identity dysregulation, which is hinged on a kind of accusation against the scapegoat identity, is a kind of God of the gaps that can, because essentially you being able to prescribe that other people should have their trust scripted according to the sociologically planned narrative that's going to ameliorate all iniquity and all problems are going to be controlled for and tend towards rectification. Because you're basically taking you're taking a group of people's free decisions and expressions of preference and decision making and their own sensibility of trust. You're not just criticizing it, but you're actually criticizing it in a strange, timeless paradigm. It's not just that you're criticizing their planning and their decision making being made independently in the future. It's also the future is conflated with the past, is conflated with the present. So it's sort of over time that as a participant, that participation from the perpetrator identity category can essentially provides the source of energy for the sociological plan that sort of brings about the utopia. And because essentially it has this, it conflates history with the future as being this interchangeable sort of, because, identity categories are so fundamentally, they're so fundamentally a weird kind of moral generalization that when you add time as a dimension that is essentially interchangeable with that source of moral accountability and scapegoating moral accountability onto that kind of entity that sort of transcends time and transcends individuals, that it's just a kind of collective sociological property that has moral consequences attached to it, that if you force people to have to fit the bill of that kind of framework, and that you essentially have an endless supply of externalizing blame and accountability and essentially filling in whatever moral part of the story needs to be cast in order to uh, uh, essentially create a kind of ideological privilege for the so-called victim identity, that they can always essentially just use their imagination of their truncated potential and preferences, which the system hasn't already facilitated for them or hasn't already delivered to them, and that the system just needs to bestow upon them better opportunities made out of the contraction of the perpetrator identities, sort of decision making and trust. And so you get a kind of a redistribution of power, which is sort of is comes from such a generalized level of analysis, such a dehumanizing, sort of way of saying, well, it's this identity versus that identity, and then conflating identity throughout history into into a singular, sort of caricature, as a weird kind of demigod, sort of pantheonic force of it's a weird kind of magic, that essentially can be used to spin any narrative yarn, because I mean also how that pantheon of identity is constructed. Who's to say that any one of the potential metrics should be the salient one, especially when you're giving it this kind of strange treatment of conflating time and it's essentially random. Like, why would you collectivize this group of people? Again, like, this kind of epidemiology, in some sense, of looking at humanity might be useful if you were actually willing to do the work of using this not as a diagnostic. You can't really extract diagnoses from this kind of data, because I mean, this is almost like throwing darts at a dartboard. It's sort of, you if you find interesting clusters of darts on a dartboard, and then you try to do a first principles investigation as to, what are the actual processes that are, let's say, in the present that are perpetuating this, then you could actually work out perhaps how to better tackle these issues. But in the sense that they are cast in the form of social psychology, you essentially never divorce yourself from this morally corrupt, generalized analysis of the human condition, which, sort of only gets away with itself because you are treating intelligence and displacing, actual intelligent and moral assessment and analysis with essentially the issue of controlling outcomes. You're displacing morality with just the question of control, and controlling for a better outcome, and not, doesn't matter if it's understood or not. I mean, but in some sense, the crazy thing is that they don't even arrive at their better outcome without essentially the huge cost of the kind of the identity dysregulation, the kind of the psychological contradiction and tension within their own so-called form of empowerment, which is essentially a form of disempowerment, and merging with the social psychology sort of paradigm and perspective, which is essentially a kind of psychosis. Because the only way that you can sort of achieve it is if you basically transition into seeing yourself as a perfect reflection of the identity, and it obviously becomes more and more overtly fascistic and sort of delusional, and its whole sort of psychological structure gets more and more pathetic and fragmented. Um, anyway, so what was the point that I ended on the last recording? It was just the yeah, so this ability to sort of gain, say, on top of other people's expressions of trust or their personal preferences, being able to sort of override them and to prescribe to them that they need to sort of fulfill this ideological obligation so that the system can go through some kind of rectification procedure, or which is this kind of the sociological planning, which in some sense essentially the leveraging of double standards in order to supposedly fix the system, um, and that has such that sociological planning has such a deep imperative, um, such a hyperbolic moral hysteria attached to it, that you don't have the time to even suspend your disbelief in any kind of alternative analysis of these matters. So raw and brittle are the superficial claims that make up this program, this bundle of sort of ideological machination. And which is essentially completely invested into its unilateral dictatorial ability to control, towards supposedly its better outcome for everything. So it's sort of control becomes essentially the control, which includes the control in labeling, appropriating all the good labels, as the fascists always do. They always say that we stand for everything that's good. That's why they always clothe themselves in anything that has a positive connotation. They just appropriate. They just say, well, we are social justice. We, all the good words pertain to us. In the same way that Hitler, he could just heap labels onto himself. That's why they call themselves socialists as well. They call themselves national. They call themselves nationalists. They call themselves socialists. Anything. They call themselves a workers' party. Anything sort of underdog orientated, to prove that essentially, so that they could just semantically claim their bona fide position, because which is essentially only capable of holding that as a reactive defensive maneuver, that almost as a way to preemptively say, well, you see, they don't even accept our own labels, so they don't even give us the room to describe ourselves. That's how oppressive they are. It's almost like it's a booby trap gambit, that they say these things that are sort of palpably dishonest as a trap. You can see this all over in terms of feminism, where it's sort of like they complain about, well, I guess there are different forms of feminism. It just shows the kind of the schizophrenia within the whole thing. The sex positive feminist versus the other kind of feminist, and you see the ones that essentially aren't sex positive dressing up in the most sort of lewd, suggestive way, so that they can they're sort of like walking feminist traps to try to sort of create opportunities of them being able to deploy their sadistically edged reactive mentality, sort of passive aggressiveness, because the whole thing is sort of couched in those kinds of tactics. That you have a lure, you have a baited hook. That's the only way that it can sort of activate. Yeah, so I mean, what was spoken about with Iron Sun, what I was getting into, which is, essentially that for me the best way to sort of deal with these kinds of ideologues is to essentially stand up not for the social construct which they are seeking to attack and displace with their ideological sociological planning, but to just say, well, like my beliefs might amount to a social construct, but I don't hold them to try to endorse a social construct. They might aggregate out in society to be a social construct, but I actually personally have these beliefs. I actually personally have these views about gender, and so I can't have them prescribed to me because they are my personal beliefs, essentially. That it's my, that I'm not trying to vindicate a sociological construct or a social construct. It's that, these are things that are semantically, that's how I stabilize my personal reality, that's how I use language. And, obviously there is a bit of a strange argument to be had, because essentially language doesn't function if it's not a set of agreed upon conventions. If the definitions are in some kind of controversy, that makes it actually hard to communicate, which is kind of also the point of them trying to essentially in a kind of totalitarian drive sequester the lexicon, um, to kind of take out the platform that anyone else might even have in order to challenge them. It's sort of like in the same way that in the Orwellian sense of, sort of removing ideas and removing words so that people can't even have a disagreeable thought to their program, because they're not happy to have the honest disagreement. They're doing something much more subversive and, in some sense, I mean, there is a kind of fundamental dishonesty that the whole thing is hinged on, but then it only excuses its excuse for doing that is that it's a defensive, reactive necessity, because they have been trespassed upon first. So it's very strange that all their complaints are essentially, like, especially with all the postmodernism stuff, like how they complain about everything having, a kind of relativism or everything having a bias. They end up, in some sense, magnifying those general claims that they make, that they, supposedly transcend. They exacerbate, in some sense, and exemplify the most themselves. But sorry, the point that I was trying to get into, was just essentially affirming the individualistic framework and speaking from that and using that essentially as your source of authority, which is a weird kind of humility as well, but that essentially brings in a paradigm which essentially, they're not really capable of cracking, because you're just saying, well, I'm not talking on behalf of society at large. I'm not trying to defend social constructs. I'm trying to defend my own honestly held beliefs. And essentially all they can sort of do is sort of gainsay and table thump the deeper imperative of needing a sociological plan. And I mean, usually my response to that is just the track record of implementing any kind of policy according to your sociological imperative and planning is essentially that, you substitute actually doing anything progressive or transformational with essentially being disruptive, but not in a way that is actually brings about ostensibly what people like you say that you even want to bring about. It's essentially, It's just a program of control. And it's a kind of abstract, hypothetical control that is built on this basic moral foundation that moral consideration is vested in someone's identity, and that the social construct of the identity is the pinnacle of is in some sense the primary bastion and vestige of all human value and consideration, is somewhat a component of identity. And that basic conflation or reductionism is just fundamentally untrue. It is fundamentally dislocated from even psychology. It grounds everything in sociology, which is it's in some sense it tries to say that sociology is the container of philosophy itself, or something like that. It tries to make this weird claim that sociology is the biggest frame in consciousness, or something like that, that it is the absolute phenomenological, sort of base truth, or the closest that we can ever get to within thought, or something like that. And so, tracing everything into a sociological reductionism, is fundamentally to treat people like hive insects. It is to completely throw away the baby with the bathwater. Anyway, so let me just find the main point here. So just that, I think, is the only way to sort of ground individual people who are having some kind of potentially authentic discourse, to show them the alternative perspective from their sort of sociological machination. And in some sense, it is to ground the importance of understanding in the context of an individual, and not understanding in the context of an identity, which is in some sense to be completely ideologically possessed by sort of by a pantheon of these strange entities, which are essentially just assumed to hold all moral consideration and be the source of human morality. In the category of identity. And so I mean, the lack of first principles in their thinking, in their oversimplified, sort of circular reasoning, and between the two pillars of the semantic claim that they make and the sociological planning that they make. Okay, so I'm just tying thing. Now I'm just repeating myself abjectly, but yeah, I think that touches on everything. But I just think, just to make this point again, that the dishonesty is essentially made out of being able to override or parasitically displace other people's, like hypothetically, other people's participation and contribution. That the participation of the scapegoated identity, of the perpetrator identity, is used as the glue that sort of makes the dishonesty opaque to itself. So it's convenient reframing of the narrative, and it's sort of that everything gets foisted to in everything is that is the sort of the pliable, malleable material. The perpetrator's identity is the putty that fixes up the pristine, sort of oversimplified moral narrative. So yeah, I mean, for me, it's always interesting that the kind of dishonesty that is leveraged is essentially always this kind of sadistically edged, defensive, passive aggressiveness. and it's it's always disgusting because when you see these people in exchanges, it's just it's always the same attitude. It's always the same sort of that they pretend to be comedians. That sort of to have even a discourse where they have to substantiate their point of view is beneath them, because essentially they've already won because their premises already predict. It has this weird kind of timeless quality to it that you can't walk someone through the reasoning, because you just have to believe in the program. You just have to believe in the basic tenets, and then sort of the paradigm comes into view. And because it's an interpretive valence, it's an interpretive reality filter that orders your perception and your judgment, so that you can enjoy this identity dysregulation. And this is why you get the same. It's always this kind of comedic, sardonic treatment, of treating the other interlocutor as being as a diminutive, sort of pleb, that they actually seek to hold a differing view from someone who represents a kind of an analysis of the identity matrix. And you can see this, with sort of Professor Dyson, that sort of, and all the dirty race baiting fascists, that all have this same quality. And the feminists that have the same tone and the same tenor, and that same sort of misanthropic, sort of tone of lecturing and diminution. Anyway, okay, I've probably said everything that I can.